Thanks for everyone for joining. My name is Laurent Carpenter. I'm the Director of Policy and Research here at CCI. Just to give you a bit of the run of play for today, I'm going to be going over the high-level findings and discussion of our new policy report that just launched yesterday, Building at Scale, which is our first policy report on innovation and Canada's housing crisis. We'll then turn to our panel. And joining me today are James Broadhead, the COO of IGV Housing, located in BC, and Kaylee Thiessen, who is the chief economist at the Canadian Shield Institute. So we'll sort of, after I give a little bit of a flyover, we'll go into a panel discussion for most of the balance of the time with an opportunity for Q&A at the end. So without too much further ado, Gabby, if you can go over to the next slide, let's get started. So housing. Everyone knows it's a housing crisis. This has been our Canadian reality now, that was localized in Vancouver and Toronto and some other pockets, a decade ago, but now truly is everywhere. And to our mind, this is an innovation issue. It's not just a cost of living crisis. Not only does the high cost of living make it harder for companies to attract and retain top flight talent, it also it acts as a sink for investment that could otherwise be going into startups and scale-ups. Why take the risk if land and buildings are getting more expensive every day? So to us, this is kind of a triple-pronged issue. It's a talent issue for innovators, it's a capital issue for innovators, and it's an affordability crisis for everyone. So it's in all of our interests to see this resolved. What's the scale of the housing crisis? The CMHC has found that we need to build 5.8 million homes to restore affordability to 2004 levels. That this is a lot of homes, and as well, we're looking at a considerable labor force crunch. So things are going to have to change, and we're going to get into a little bit, the big picture of the sector and what that looks like economically. So, Gabby, let's go over to the next slide. So I mentioned the labor force and the size of the sector. It's about 7.5% of Canada's GDP, which is quite large. It's about half the size of the natural resource sector, give or take. And it's bigger than a construction sector in any other G7 country. So it's quite top heavy in that way. It's also becoming quite an old sector. 1 in 5 workers are over 65, and right now they're retiring faster than they can be replaced. The industry has also gotten less productive since the pandemic. Before the pandemic, every hour worked produced roughly $60 worth of output. It's now down to 50%, which is pretty alarming. That's about 15% in 5 years. Very concerning. We also see very, very low tech adoption across the sector, and 82% of the output is from really small firms. And bottom line here is that what this looks like, if you zoom out, this is an artisanal sector. If we had someone from the Middle Ages who spent their career building cathedrals, transported in time to Canada's housing sector today, he would find it pretty familiar. And probably quite comforting. But while that's wonderful for our time traveler, it's probably less good for Canada. And we have an industrial scale problem that we need to solve at industrial scale. So we talked to innovators kind of all over the country, some experts, and came to some observations and conclusions. What's the difference, first of all, between artisanal and industrial? Labor intensive versus capital intensive, and then bespoke versus standardized. This is really the central insight of industrialization in general is, doing something the same way over and over and over again is a lot more effective than doing, a series of one-offs. Cathedrals are great, but, they've been building that one in Barcelona for quite some time now. And if we relied on Barcelonan cathedral builders to solve our housing crisis, we'd be waiting a while. Building homes and factories is not a new concept, but it hasn't taken off in Canada like it has elsewhere. And why is that? I think this is kind of the million-dollar question. And we found a couple of factors. One is that there's a mess of building regulations across and within jurisdictions. So, to go back to our kind of auto comparator here, if every Toyota Camry had to be made differently for every town, we would not be making a lot of Toyota Camrys. It would be pretty grim. So being able to actually make one design or a small set of designs across the country versus having to do tons and tons of one-off customization is going to be a very important thing. So harmonizing and bringing regulations into sync across the country, more uniform land use. So Bill 44 in BC is kind of a good example of this. Also, building codes often don't allow for innovation. They very much lock you into one way of doing things. For example, this is an example that comes up quite a bit, is fire safety. Historically, this has been something that's been very prescriptive, where you need to have, made of X material versus able to withstand Y amount of time in a fire. So it locks you into just having to do it the one way versus experimenting with what works well. So Gabby, we can go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, that's, the performance-based codes is one piece that we think would be very interesting and offer some solutions here on top of the regulatory element. And I got a little ahead of myself there, so Gabby, we can go right on ahead to the next one. So the other thing is, when we talk about factory-built housing, often traditional construction finance isn't a good fit for them. And that's because usually banks issue construction finance based on improvement to the value of the land, which, if you're building something in a factory, doesn't happen until the last minute. So basically, you're looking at a bit of a gap between where financing usually starts and where it starts with factory-built homes. So this front loads costs and risks, which is a big barrier to innovation. Usually when we're talking about, valley of death, the sort of counterpart to that is the mountain of risk, where you have to just front so much capital if it's not available privately that it becomes prohibitive. For instance, if you're building kind of a missing middle, low rise or mid rise structure in a factory, that's just prohibitive because the amount of capital you'd need upfront to make that happen is just absurd. So it doesn't really happen right now, unfortunately. Capital investments, big and small, whether that's industrial robots in a factory setting, or even doing things like building information models, which can help reduce the life cycle cost of a building because it's a perfect, digital replication of the structure, means that you have a lot less guesswork going on about what's in it, and you can turn that over to the homeowner. It's a cost that, the builder would have to internalize right now versus having it be kind of standard, even though it would reduce costs over the long term. So, we see a couple of possible solutions there. One thing is finding some novel financial structures, working with the banks to make that happen, so that we're changing the model there, so that it's not this huge mountain of risk, but that it's spread out like more traditional construction. Or we have long-term bankable procurement. I shouldn't say or, really and or. Perhaps both would be the best option here. So we can go to the next slide. I mentioned that the workforce is retiring faster than it can be replaced, and that we need 500,000 new workers to meet our 2030 housing targets. I think it's not a stretch to say that this is just not going to happen under the status quo. So industrial building can absolutely be a productivity multiplier, and has to. And there's still a need for on-site expertise. So, I think when people are worried about job losses, right now we can't hire them fast enough. So I think if we're able to kind of multiply the amount of productivity and the amount of homes that we're able to build by bringing more technology and better organization to the process, that's only a good thing. And one thing that we can do to help with that is training workers on new technologies that can make the sector more productive. There's a lot that still has to happen on site, and a lot of that can be done better with technology. The other and sort of final piece is, looking at this big picture here. Canada is the world's biggest exporter of timber. This is, a real strength for us, and it's a historic industry in Canada. We have the deep irony here is that of the 600 or so mass timber buildings in the country, which is timber that's built in these structural panels called cross-laminated or glue-laminated timber. Most of these buildings have been built with European lumber and panels, which is crazy. Like, we are the world's biggest lumber exporter. We're certainly growing the trees here. We're not running out of them anytime soon, and we have, one of the world's most respected and sustainable forestry industries. There's no reason we should be having to import European lumber and panels, and there's no reason we shouldn't be leading this industry globally. And it's growing 14% a year in North America. Like I said, absolutely no reason we shouldn't be a global leader here, particularly as we're looking at, more trade restrictions with the US, particularly in forestry, and of course the long-standing softwood lumber issue. Finding alternative places to export value-added products, I think, is something we would really like to look at as a country. We have an incredible value chain here that we can really move up the stack into more valuable pieces, and build up innovation and export champions in that space. Gabby, if we can go to the next slide. Oh, is that the end of it? Excellent. So thanks, Gabby, for that, and thanks everyone. That's kind of the high level of the report. So I'll bring it over to our panel now, and I introduced them really quickly earlier, but I'd be happy to let them introduce themselves at a bit greater length. So James, you're the COO at IGV Housing in BC, as well as some other hats. So feel free to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Lauren. When you're kind of talking there, and you're talking about, this artisan industry that we find ourselves and all the barriers to the reason why innovation can get stifled and some of the big capital costs, these are actually all the issues that we're facing today. So IGV Housing is a purpose-built manufacturer that works in hybrid construction. And so our approach really is about how we take all the different components and we de-risk the construction process by having pre-approved designs, by having really engineered designs, which is all done in advance. So all the things that can take an awful lot of time and can increase the cost of the process, they're all the problems that we try and solve. I think that and we can talk a bit about this, later with some of the when we get to the panel conversations. But I think that from an industry standpoint, we see a lot of challenges with how the construction industry is currently run because every design is custom, every fabrication or whether it's on site or whether it's built in a factory is custom built, and all those risks then are also manifested in the financial side. So from my experience, all the things I've been doing for the last number of years is that I've worked in construction, building site-built projects. I've worked in development. On the construction side, I've also built a series of modular and hybrid and panelized based solutions. I did a master's in offsite housing construction, looking at the affordable housing sector and looking at really what the problems and the challenges are. So from an experience standpoint, I've got a broad range of experience in different areas, but all within the same space around construction. So it's development, it's construction, it's manufacturing. But then in addition to that, I've also covered many different verticals, not just housing. I know that's what we're here to talk about today, but I've also worked in infrastructure, in childcare, schools, commercial-based buildings. So that experience is also quite broad. IGV Housing as a business really has been set up to really supercharge the whole process. And so if you look at the way that the design process works today, it can take you $500,000. It can take you a year in design. There was a customer we were talking to last week, and they really need to get to a Class A price very, very quickly. And that's what they were looking at. It was a 12-month process. It was $500,000 just to be able to understand what the cost was going to be of that construction project before they were in a position to be able to get the finances in place. With the IGV-based solution, we could turn that around in a day because the design is already pre-done. And I think that one of the challenges or the argument against that is the high degree of customization. But I would also challenge everyone to say, do we need to have such a degree of customization of the houses that we're trying to build? Because if we do, then I just don't see how we're going to find the affordability.
Kaylee Thiessen, you are the chief economist at the Canadian Shield Institute with a long history of doing brilliant economics and especially labor work. So happy to let you introduce yourself quickly.
Sure. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see a couple of faces on the top of my screen. I am the chief economist at the Canadian Shield Institute. You may have heard of us. You may have not heard of us yet. We're a new policy studio in Canada focused on sovereignty and economic transformation. So we work to help sort of decode and help people to understand what different government decisions mean. So we'll talk about housing, we'll talk about the softwood lumber industry, some sort of shield scores that we're working on, or scores that review government decisions based on economic transformation and sovereignty that are coming out soon, focus on the steel industry and even on AI and high tech. So we will help decode government decisions and look at how they'll produce economic growth that stays in Canada versus getting siphoned out elsewhere. We also like to make sense of economic data like productivity data or inflation data. So if you go to our LinkedIn page or look at our I'm losing the word, look at our newsletter that we send out every Friday, then you'll see the different pieces that we're working on. And before that, I worked for Unifor, which is Canada's largest private sector trade union, where I focused on government policy in the aviation sector, in aerospace and defense, and economic transformation. So that's my history. Looking forward to this conversation.
Great, thanks to you both. So to start off with, I mentioned off the hop that, from CCI's perspective, we see the housing crisis through the lens of, what is its impact on innovators? And for us, we see it as something that's contributing to making it hard to attract and retain talent in this country, and also serving as a channel for depressing capital investment into companies. Because obviously it's very hard to compete with land and buildings. So thank you, Henry George, for that insight for now over 100 years. But I'm curious to know from your perspective, both from the labor and think tank world and from the actual, housing industry, what does the housing crisis look like for you? How is it something that you're sort of conceptualizing, and how does it impact your work? And maybe we can start with James there.
I think the housing crisis, if there was an easy solution, then I think it would already been done. That's the reality of what we're talking about. I don't think there's one, silver bullet that's going to be able to solve the challenge. I think that there are solutions that we can work towards, but it's going to take everybody. It's going to take industry. It's going to take the design community. It's going to take the constructing, teams to be able to think differently and work differently. It's also going to take the different levels of government. And I think that when you look more globally, where you see that there's been a big change and a mass adoption of innovation, it's really been government led. And so when you look at that from a UK standpoint, they came out and said that modern methods of construction need to be embedded into all their government RFPs. And they also then give a 10-year pipeline of work to say, this is the amount of billions of dollars that we're going to actually invest into this sector. And as a result, it allowed people from an innovation standpoint to see, okay, there's an opportunity here. There's a way that it's going to be supported. There's a way that we can invest. Because make no mistake, setting up a manufacturing plant, it's tens of millions of dollars to be able to do it at the scale that's required. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a lot of small fabricators which are setting up, and they're trying to scale up because they're trying to manage the risk of the money. And so for me, it all comes down to the management of risk. But if you want to see a big investment in innovation, I think that's where the government can really come in and make some really strong signals to people that are willing to invest in the sector. And it really is going to come down to if there's an opportunity to be able to supply product, and that product will be either prioritized or incentivized in some way, whether that's in pre-approved planning, which I understand they're working towards that, but a lot of the pre-approved planning is thinking about things like panelized. It's not necessarily thinking about modular. They've got some modular-based solutions, but I do think that it needs to be a collaborative approach from everybody, and it needs to be driven with some strong backing from a pipeline-based of work with those incentives that allow people to go and invest.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's something we talk about at CCI quite a lot, is kind of how can procurement sort of be an accelerator for innovation? And the way we look at it is that it's not just that you're picking a winner, it's that you're letting the market sort of compete internally for, what's the solution that's going to be best able to use that sort of runway in the form of business to best negotiate the learning curve ahead of them and deliver the best and most competitive innovation, and that company is going to be the one that wins. So this is something we've seen in a lot of different verticals, and housing, I think, to us is really not an exception to this. And in fact, with the new Build Canada Homes mechanism and some other channels presumably for housing policy from both the federal and provincial governments, this is really something we should be looking at really closely, is how can kind of use the procurement function to sort of drive down costs by getting over that learning curve. So Kaylee, I'll go back to you on the, what does the housing crisis look like from your and Shield's perspective?
Yeah, well, we think a lot about how it's impacting people. So the first thing I've done is grabbed a bunch of stats. Some of them you may have heard before, but some things that I learned this morning and over the last week as I was looking over this data is that about a quarter of Canadian households actually are living in housing unaffordability. So they're spending more than 30% of their income on housing. Many of you might be in that situation. And I also learned that 35% of people living in low income are spending more than 40% of their income on housing. So the lower income you have, the more actual money or the actual portion of your income that you have that you're spending on housing. And that means that it's eating into what we would otherwise spend on other things. So as you mentioned earlier, Laurent, what's happening then is that economic activity in other sectors is actually shrinking because we don't have the money to spend on that when we're kind of shoveling it all to making sure that we can afford housing. So then it's not a coincidence that food bank use has risen quite dramatically, actually doubled since 2019 in Canada. And part of the reason is how expensive housing is. Clearly, something that we need to be working on. And what used to get passed off as a big city problem, and again, Laurent, you mentioned this earlier, is now a problem that's seen across the country. Mike Moffat and the Missing Middle Initiative, they've done some really great work on this in the spring, and they do really great work every week on housing. They found that in 2005, most cities across Canada were housing affordable. There was 10 that were not. And now 41 out of 51 cities in Canada do not have housing that is affordable for the average family. That doesn't mean you're living in low income. It means you have an average income, you probably have a great job, and housing is not affordable. And they found also that 17 cities are cheekily labeled as like they're categorized as you will never be able to afford a house. So that would be Toronto and Vancouver, obviously, but there's actually 17 of those. And it's cheeky, but it's accurate. Like we need to have those cheeky sort of pieces of how to explain the housing market so that we get the attention of the policymakers who are going to design policies that make it easier to build housing faster. Whether you're renting or paying a mortgage, you feel the weight of these payments every day. And it's like university students, right? So university students are cramming more people into an apartment. Maybe you have bunk beds again, where like you used to kind of get to have your own room once you turned 18. People move in together faster when they're dating because housing is so expensive. But then when you break up, you can't move out. Because you can't afford rent. These are the ways that housing prices are affecting us. And what's really frustrating is at the same time as we're all paying more, the construction industry is producing less. And I don't think it's because builders are just like getting lazy and not construction workers aren't just not trying as hard as they used to. Productivity in the industry has declined. You had some great stats on that, so I won't go over them. But it declined the most over the last 6 years, which is just very surprising. And there's mixed information too on housing starts and housing completions. So we have now all of this attention going towards this public policy attention going towards the housing industry, but starts are slowing. Some months we see advances, some months we see a bit of slowing down, and completions are not coming close to the rates that are promised by any province across the country. The longer it takes to meet the goals that the federal government and the provinces have set out, the longer it takes for all of us to have housing affordability. And so in that way, whether you're buying a house or building a house, like we're all in this problem together to be figuring it out.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's kind of a piece I've been thinking about. We see it's two lines going in the wrong direction, right? We see these targets that we're kind of getting further and further away from as the time to actually accomplish them gets shorter and shorter. And we're seeing the labor sort of, tightness or gap turn into a big chasm as we're, expecting, a gap of 500,000 workers by 2030. So I guess I'm curious from both of your perspectives, like what is even possible or feasible? Like, which one of those things is going to break first, right? Is there a way to lessen the need through tech adoption? Like, are there other elements that you're kind of looking at as promising? And James, maybe we can start with you on. I think it'd be really useful to get a sense, perhaps, that you mentioned earlier very specifically, the time for doing a feasibility study. You were able to get that down to a day versus a year for traditional builder. Like, what does the kind of advantage of engineered solutions kind of look like from a cost perspective and time perspective? And we can kind of go into the labor piece from there.
Before I answer that, I just wanted to address some of the things that Kaylee was talking about, or even build on it, because all the points that Kaylee was making, I think, are incredibly important and very, very valid for all Canadians. I also think that in addition to that, and it's not going against, but in addition to, you've got this incredible sector of construction workers, of developers that are very skilled and very good at what they do, and the challenges that they're facing is, I think there's a misconception that it's they're just making more money, or they're not making as much money, therefore they don't want to build. The reality of the cost of construction today is that everything is costing more, and so because everything costs more, the pro formas don't work. And then you've got a financial sector that's also looking at the developments going, yeah, does this make sense? Is there too much risk in these developments to actually action them? And so even though that there is this great need, there is a lot of risk associated in the market today. And part of that can be talked to in terms of tariffs. There's a whole load of other things that we can talk to as the drivers for those. But the point being is that we've got this incredible sector that wants to work, that wants to deliver, that actually has workforces. They don't want to lay people off, but they're in positions that the pro formas are just not tracking the way that they need to be able to turn even a small profit. And so whether you call, the government should be taking more of a direct role in housing, or whether the contractor or developers should be leading it, that there's arguments for both sides. Developers and contractors are experts at what they do. And the reality is that the way that the market looks today for them is very challenging. Could you just repeat your question again, please?
Yeah, sure. Just to kind of pick up on that, like what it kind of is the cost advantage of moving to, a more industrialized home building? Because we've been talking about the abstract, but I'd love to get your kind of perspective and detail for the audience of, what does that look like in practice?
So in simple terms, you've got your initial feasibility where people look at a site, they look at a pro forma, they look at the setbacks, look at all the municipal requirements. Those regulations can change from municipality to municipality, which creates extra cost, extra risk, extra time. You then go through and engage a full design team to be able to manage those risks and come up with a design. They're typically coming up with something which is custom. Now, even the big builders, they'll have kind of floor plans or they'll have floor plates or they'll have a level of repeatability where they're trying to get it. But if they're working in a new market sector, they don't have the same supply chain. So that becomes new for them. The site constraints are always going to be different in terms of the setbacks. If you go from one jurisdiction, so if you go from Vancouver and over to the border of Burnaby, you can have different requirements, or even in North Vancouver versus the city of Vancouver. So just some more localized different, and you're talking a kilometer difference, and then suddenly you're in a different set of regulations. And then you have to go through the entire design process to be able to get to a price. Now, that's in the more conventional way, and you do it as a design, and then you might bring on a CM at some point, or you do a design and a bid. Design builders can get there a lot faster, but then you're shifting the risk. And so that risk shift comes at a cost. You're shifting everything to the front end, but then they also need to then de-risk all those costs because there's so many unknowns. And so the point and the timing of contract is very different, which then also then has a cost driver. And so when I look at it, I look at that entire process. It's very long, it's very custom, it's very expensive, and quite frankly, it can be challenging. And the kicker for the developers, they can put $1 million into a project and still not be sure that it's going to go ahead. And so that's what we're asking, the private sector to do. And as a result, they can have projects which can get tied up into red tape in municipalities for 7 years if they have to go through things like rezoning, and they've got to go through the different design panels. So that's the conventional construction process, the way that we see it today. If you look at the big sector disruptions of just the things that I can think of that I've seen, the introduction of the internet, introduction of AI more recently. You've got Uber, Airbnb, and what they've done to a sector is they've just changed the way of thinking. And as a result, you've seen a much bigger impact on the sector. And so from an IGV housing standpoint, we're investing all that money up front. So we're paying for the design, we're paying for the engineering, for the mechanical, the electrical, and the architectural, and getting to a point that you've got and the structural. So we get to a point that we've got this engineered to order design. So we've paid for that design once, but we can pass on those savings to everybody else, and we can give a certainty in cost because the design is done. So we've taken the risk of an entire project and reduced it down to just the building component has now been locked in. So then you get a guaranteed in schedule. You can know how far away your supply chain is. We can nest it in terms of the manufacturing space. So all of those things are very important to be able to drive down the costing, because we can get to certainty a lot sooner. And then we're taking a full construction project and you're diminishing the risk down to the site, not to be diminishing is probably the wrong word, but not to diminish the risk, but to try and reduce that risk in that particular area, albeit that can be very compactful. Then people are focusing on just what that specific requirements are. So I would suggest that moving into more of an industrialized design, having configuration like you would purchase a car is the approach that we take. So if you buy a car, and you made the example earlier of the Toyota Camry, well, then you can pick a different trim package. You can pick the comfort package. Maybe not a Camry, but you can have a tow package. And so all of those things are different options that you can add on to be able to get the vehicle that you want. You don't go and buy a custom vehicle, have it custom designed, have the parts then delivered on site, and then build it yourself. So we have this approach to manufacturing that really, or construction, that really hasn't changed. And so the way that we work needs to be different. But for that to be successful, there are some barriers that we do need to be able to overcome. But I can tell you right now, we're in a position on our forecasting, we expect to be able to build a fourplex complete kit of parts. So that's kitchens, bathrooms, like everything ready to go within 1 day. So like one can come off the line every single day is the scale that we can get to. And with a higher increase in orders, we can drive down the cost, because we're actually just putting more through the same process. It's the same machine that's working. And so that's the level of industrialization that we're going down. And I believe that that's more representative of where the sector can get to, but people have to shift their thinking to the outcome they're trying to get to, and then be comfortable with a different process to achieve that outcome. And the one thing I want to be very clear on is that from a perception standpoint, the offsite industry is that people will say, to get to a lower cost, you have to reduce the quality. Yeah, that can be the case if you follow conventional practices. But we talk about this a lot, that and Elon Musk, I think, is the one that coined it. He talks about the idiot factor. He talks about the fact that you've got the cost of the parts, and then the difference between the cost of the parts and what it costs to make and what you pay for it. That's the idiot factor, because you're overpaying. And so from our standpoint, we go deep into the supply chain and we go direct to source. So we cut out as many middlemen as possible, because we've got the repeatability and we've got the scale. We can we can buy 100 kitchens at a time because they're exactly the same. And if in conventional construction, you just don't have the ability to do that.
Yeah, James, like we were talking earlier about how, procurement and pieces like that, like large scale, order books can really make a difference. And in a sense, you're kind of taking, you could take the big, large order book of a large manufacturer that has some certainty from government and sort of pass that on through the supply chain to know that you're building an industry that has some legs and can build supply networks and kind of innovate around there. Kaylee, is there anything you wanted to pick up on any of that?
Well, I'm thinking back to the question about labor.
Yeah.
And the risks that you were talking about taking on as we're looking at a transition, the people who work in the industry, the people who want to work in the industry, from the labor market perspective, like the jobs that exist in the industry, like that is kind of being put at risk too. Not that the industry is going to destroy every job that exists in construction, but through the transition process, we are risking the incomes that people currently have, right? Their livelihood, potential livelihoods of people who are coming through, and thinking about that as another risk that needs to be either mitigated or dealt with. Yesterday's announcement from the federal government that the budget will invest in Canada's workforce, it actually starts with a promise to expand training for new skilled trades workers, training people in Red Seal skilled trades. I didn't hear you say that we don't need electricians or plumbers or anything anymore. And James, you could maybe tell me if I'm wrong, but those folks are still going to be needed. But becoming a skilled trades worker, a certified skilled tradesperson, requires commitment from the apprentice who's starting out in the industry and from the employer who is building the home and providing that work. Both people need to be committed, both organizations need to be committed to the person getting through that process. And it's a 4-year process. If this is happening faster, I don't know the answer to this question, but what does it mean for people who are trying to get into this industry? Will they have to move more often? Will they have to go to many more job sites? And that's one piece of the risk equation. We also talked about the number of people who work in the industry who are like over 65. One thing that when I was working with skilled trades workers as a researcher for them, so not on site, but researching different policy options, we found that the age gap between someone who is a certified journey person and someone who is an apprentice and like learning the process is almost 30 years. So if you imagine who you are right now in your generation, talking to someone who's 2 generations below you, and just like the massive mind shift that you have to go through in order to like find a way to communicate together. And then you're doing that communication on a dangerous job site or in a job that requires like adherence to very specific processes when you're on site. We need to be finding ways to build a bridge so folks are able to communicate to each other better. And that's another important piece of the equation. And another thing that we really learned as we were doing the research is that younger folks, women, enter the skilled trades, get onto a job site, find out that the culture of that job site is not enjoyable. And you all can imagine the different pieces of what that means. And so people who are trained up, the people that we do need, those 500,000 workers that are leaving, maybe we need to replace 200,000 of those workers with the innovations that are coming. We still need those people. And if we're getting people into the job and then they get there and they're like, oh, I don't like my work culture, I don't enjoy being on this job site, and they move on, then we're not doing a service to the training process and we're not doing a service to the industry or to the people who are trying to buy these homes at an affordable price.
Yeah, thanks. And James, anything you want to pick up on from that? And I'll just say before you do that, just if folks have questions they want to ask, feel free to drop them in the chat. We're happy to just kind of go into audience questions as it kind of feeds into the conversation. I got a couple, points I'm seeing that I'd like to raise, but yeah, go ahead, James.
The Labour conversation is a very interesting one, and I think that we need to take a more global view when we think about the sector, because the amount of houses that are in Canada, I've done a lot of work with First Nation developments, I've done a lot of work off reserve in municipalities. There is a lot of renovation work. There is a lot of call outs. There's a lot of challenges with replacing leaky pipes, with electrical. So you've got the whole service sector, then you've got the renovation sector. Like that renovation sector is huge in terms of the amount of stuff that needs to be and can be retrofitted rather than just buying new. The new construction sector is just a percentage of the overall sector that we're talking about. And so when I look at the number of people which are then are considering not going into trades, I think that I've got two boys, 9 and 11. My recommendation to them is go get a trade, because you're going to be the commodity. Like it's not going to be a commodity. It's going to be such a scarce place for you to go be that there is going to be so much work that there is nothing better than going down that path, in my opinion. The couple of the points that you raised was around does prefabrication, does that reduce the requirements for plumbers and electricians? That's kind of the point. The point is that if we continue to do things the way that we do, and we just build the same way that we do on site in a factory, we're not going to find the level of innovation that we need to actually drive down the cost. We have to change the process. We still need electricians and we still need plumbers. They still have to be certified products. But if we can pre-manufacture components in advance, it means I'm not paying somebody, $120 an hour. I'm paying someone a lot less, or a fraction of that, to be able to put those components together, but it's still installed by an electrician. And so it really means that we're trying to just add more capacity to the space. When it gets to site, you're still going to need electricians and plumbers to be able to go do that work. It just means they're doing different work. They're connecting houses versus wiring houses from scratch. And so it's really just changing the way that we're doing. But to me, the whole sector is going to be built on trades. But if we compare trades with innovation, with pre-manufacturing, with robotics, with AI, then you're going to have this beautiful place where it is going to be in harmony. The last point you raised was around culture. And we've gone through a big hiring phase recently. And one of the common things that actually came up when we were talking to people from different backgrounds, different trades, and bringing them into the manufacturing site. And this wasn't just from construction workers. This is people that's worked in sawmills, they've worked in industrial, they've worked in commercial sectors. They wanted to be in a safe environment. So safety was important. Collaboration was incredibly important to them. And they didn't want to get shouted at. Like the world that we live in, people say, like actually come into interviews saying, just please don't shout at me if I do something wrong. I couldn't believe that was the experience that they had. But this is not unique to construction. And so from our standpoint, when I look at it from a manufacturing perspective, you've got way more control, not over just the built environment and how you're producing products. You've actually got a lot more control over the culture, because it's not like you're sat in an office and you've got many different construction sites where you can't see what's happening. It's all happening in that one space. And so you can actually instill and be able to control the culture of safety, of collaboration, of making sure that it's a safe place for everybody to work, regardless of their background. And as a result, we actually had a lot of local nations start coming to us asking if we could employ, because they were hearing the work that we were doing. But I don't think that we're unique in that space. I think it's actually just more systematic because of the way that we approach it. We're able to offer that. And I think that would be the same for anybody else that is in a similar position to us, I would think.
Yeah, super interesting. I want to start picking up on some audience points a little bit. So Aiden had asked earlier, or sort of commented earlier, that building more single family homes endlessly can't be the whole solution to the housing crisis. And I mentioned earlier that there's a potential for using more factory built housing in the context of missing middle, kind of low and mid rise. I'm curious, James, like what does the picture of that industry kind of look like in Canada at present? I talked a bit about mass timber, but would love to hear kind of on the ground whether that's kind of a growing sector or something that there's still a need for development there.
I think that there's a need for all of it. It just really there's different. What we're talking about is dividing the ocean. It's so vast. And the reality is that there are a lot of people that still want to live in a single family home. But if you can drive down that cost by 50%, why shouldn't they be able to? If it's a land issue and we can actually put two homes on the same lot, great. Well, that's what Bill 44 is all about. It's actually increasing the density on lots, and it's allowing people to be able to fast track. Ideally, they still need to work out some of the details, but be able to fast track some of the permitting-based processes. They can actually go and solve some of those challenges. And so I actually think there's a place for all of it. And I really just think it's about meeting people where they're at, because you talk about electricians and plumbers. They make good wages, but can they afford a single family home in some jurisdictions? No, they can't. Should you think they should be able to? Well, if it exists, why not? And so I actually think the issue is not as much about the form and character. Yes, it helps if you've got higher density on lots. Yes, it helps in terms of bringing down the land costs, but that's one component to it. I think the bigger problem is, how do you solve the cost of construction holistically? And if you can solve that, now we're talking about boiling the ocean. And that is a very, very different outcome compared to saying we need to go down one particular path. And the reality is, where we live in Canada and across Canada, it's going to be very different to the style that people want to live in downtown Vancouver versus Winnipeg versus Calgary or Edmonton. And I think that everybody should have a choice to be able to live on their own terms, which need to be able to give people the options to be able to get there.
Yeah. Yeah. Kaylee, this is a bit of an abstract question. Actually, did you want to pick up on that? I saw you kind of jump in.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to talk a little bit about the federal government's softwood lumber and mass timber plan, which is a response to the trade war, right? If we are going to see a decline in manufacturing industry and other industries as a result of a drop in demand from the United States, then we need to create the supply and demand for our own natural resources and sort of mid-level processed resources right here in Canada. And so the mass timber industry, the softwood lumber industry, is one very obvious place that we should be doing that as quickly as possible. Government does have, I think it's a $1.2 billion plan to accelerate the softwood lumber industry. And part of that is to feed directly into Build Canada Homes, which is the government's plan to help boost the affordable housing stock in this country. Hopefully that can all come together. We need labor, we need industry, we need government, we need everybody at the table to make sure that this works in a way that actually accelerates home building and builds, like James was saying, all the different types of housing that are needed or demanded by people. People should have a choice to live in the type of home that they'd like. I love living in a condo, no kids, no pets, no chores. It's wonderful. Not everybody wants that. And so we need to be building all different styles, and we could be doing that with lumber, softwood lumber and mass timber from Canada instead of bringing it in from Europe.
Yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to ask you about, was that what's the sovereignty angle here? Because I think, to me, there's a bit
Yeah.
of, there's a link you can really feel in your gut between, being able to afford a home and that being a scarce commodity in Canada, and us, feeling like a sovereign country. Because I think those two things they're connected in a way that I feel hard to articulate, but I think feels intuitive to people. So I just love to hear you a little bit on that kind of broad theme of, what do you think is sort of the interplay of that challenge, that threat, and maybe the opportunity there as well.
Yeah, so thinking about from economic sovereignty or economic transformation and sovereignty, the opportunity is for us to be building value, creating value all along the supply chain. So you have the house that's built in Canada, and it's also built with materials that are processed in Canada, and it is built with natural resources that are harvested in Canada. And also then the horticulture that's required to sustainably replace timber that is cut down every year. So all of that could be done right here. And then we're creating value all along the value chain. So it's jobs along the value chain, it's GDP along the value chain. There's all sorts of innovations that come with that. And that means there's IP in different pieces of the value chain. And that then creates a more sovereign economy because we are reliant on ourselves instead of reliant on another country to do that work for us. And then if it can be owned by Canadians on top of it, instead of all using FDI, then even more value is delivered to Canada. And then if you think on an individual sovereignty perspective, it's the ability to choose for ourselves what kind of lifestyle we want. Many people want to be renters. Many people want to be homeowners. And if there is choice and everything is affordable, then we're not being squeezed into constrained choice that's like dying in your apartment because you can never move because you got into your apartment before rent control was canceled. Those are some of the sovereignty angles.
Yeah, that's really like I think that there's a lot there to unpack. James, I want to ask you a little bit. You had mentioned the UK's approach to this, and I mentioned earlier, I think North America is a bit of a standout in terms of where we're at in offsite construction compared to other parts of the world. I'm curious, why do you think that is? That maybe we're not quite as advanced as Europe and some other jurisdictions in being further along here, considering that obviously we have all the advantages of scale and natural resources that we could want. What's kind of been holding the sector back there, or perhaps why has Europe gone faster and further?
I think when we started this conversation, we're actually talking about time zones, and we're talking about the fact that I think did you say there's four or four and a half time zones in Canada? And so you just start thinking about how vast the country is. And so, if you've got a really incredible manufacturing-based facility in Calgary, trying to get that to transport and do that work on the East Coast is going to be a lot more challenging. And whereas if you look at somewhere like the UK, you've got 70 million people that live in a space that is a third the size of British Columbia. And so, that transportation piece becomes way less impactful. And so that you can get these like clusters or you get these innovation hubs that can really come together to be able to drive some of that change. The government has been very interested in the UK for many years. And I'm not saying that Canada hasn't, because I do believe that they had an interest in the sector. But their approach in the UK was more, they're going to supercharge the adoption by mandating it. And by mandating it and incentivizing it, two sides of the same coin. But they were really kind of saying, we're going to give you this pipeline of work. If you can deliver this amount of projects in this time frame, and it really allowed that level of investment by the innovators, and so that they could then really back into it. Because put yourselves in the shoes of, say, an architect. Why would you change? You've got a great gig, right? And architects, I think, are some of the best people in the world when you talk to them in construction. They're very knowledgeable. They're always thinking about the livability. They're thinking about sustainability. All the drivers, I think, are really positive. But how they get paid is a bit different. They get paid on every single project based on the value of the project. And so there isn't a lot of incentive there to go and come up with affordability or new ways of working. And so that's just one aspect, but it's more representative of the entire culture within the industry. And so what you're asking to do is, what you're actually asking is everyone to change, and that's hard. And so people aren't going to change unless the current position they're in is hard enough that it's gonna drive that level to look for something new, or alternatively they're forced to do it through regulation changes or opportunity. And so it's that change factor which is big, and that's what the government did. They really pushed on that to try and supercharge it, and they were successful in getting a much higher adoption rate.
Yeah, that's awesome, because I was going to ask a question from the audience here, but I think you pretty much just touched on it, which is from Connie. Can any of you comment on the policy/investments in technology deal with regulatory complexity? I know that's a piece the architects are kind of dealing with to some extent there too. Any other sort of verticals on that you'd want to take a swing at?
Specifically on regulatory?
Yeah, and like certainly I think we talked a little bit about on municipal permitting. I think there's ways that we can have technology simplify some of this, and I should give a shout out to our friends at the Digital Governance Council who have developed two standards for municipalities on how to sort of standardize municipal permitting applications. So thank you to them. I think that's that kind of a very important spade work that does not sound very sexy when you say it out loud, but is really important if we're going to do this at scale. Is great. So Connie, that's perhaps one piece. And yeah, James and Kaylee, if you guys can, if you have anything else in how maybe technology can be leveraged to deal with regulatory complexity, would love to hear it.
Katie, do you want to go first, and I'll pick it up afterwards?
Sure. I'm not necessarily thinking about a technology, but perhaps it's an opportunity for someone to develop a technology. So in the transit space, we've talked for 10 years about the possibility of getting transit agencies to develop RFPs together and just buy buses. Everybody buys buses together, then they become cheaper, and you buy them from one or two companies. And it's been an incredibly complex task and hasn't gone very far because everyone wants to have control over the RFP process, because everyone has these little tiny requirements. Thinking a little bit, James, about what you were talking about in terms of the different styles of car you can buy, same car, different add-ons, like you can add a moonroof or a sunroof, that kind of thing. Is there a way to do the same thing, looking at the transit vehicle industry and translating that, and then also to think about building regulations across the province? Let's say we're looking at Ontario, that's where I'm based, so that everyone has a chance to weigh in on what those regulations would be, permitting processes, et cetera, and then they buy the technology together but still administer it on their own. Perhaps someone has already designed that, and Laurent, you can you can let me know. But these pieces where some of the questions are done ahead of time together, and then there are still elements of control that are sort of administered by whatever municipality we're working at, so that the costs are eliminated, because every municipality is drowning in permit applications, and also they're able to deliver for their constituents.
It's such an interesting topic. Lauren, you said it wasn't, but I find it fascinating.
It's not sexy. It is
You're fun
interesting.
at parties, James. You're fun at parties.
I'm going in the corner, just holding court. I'm the guy they flip to bed at 10 a.m. No, I okay. So let me talk about where I've had these conversations. I met with a series of building officials, and I was talking to them about what their challenges are and what they see, and when they're going through the regulatory process. I, in addition, met with a municipality that was trying to streamline, and it was all part of the CMHC housing affordability and how they can like the acceleration fund that they were working on to try and accelerate permitting processes. And so everyone was trying to wrestle around this whole concept of how do they do this, and can prefabrication be part of the solution? And what I got from the conversations is that people don't understand from a regulatory process how to work with prefabrication. They don't understand how to work through that engineered process. And if I go back to the way that typically things happen, the reason why they're reviewing the drawings, in their words, not mine, is that they review the drawings of the permit application to make sure they don't have unscrupulous characters doing unscrupulous work. And so they want to make sure that they feel an obligation to protect and to be able to serve. And so so in that conversation, what they're really trying to do is they spend a lot of time on the front end working through the reviews of the processes. They won't just rely on the stamp of the architect or the structural engineers. They want to see more information. They want to go in a little bit deeper and understand it before they even give people a building permit. Then they go and do the inspections. And so the inspections then become a little bit different, because every fire chief might have a different approach about how they want to deal with fire stopping. So the keys ones to me would be the building permit process is catered towards a conventional or traditional build, because they're trying to make sure it's done properly. They want to inspect the work on site because they've got no way to have the approval or confidence that the work has been done without visually being able to see it at each part of the construction process. And then you've got the fire chiefs that also then can come to the table once it's done and say, that's not what we thought or what we had in mind. We need to go and change the approach. And then the last piece is, albeit, yes, you've got the building code that you're working towards, you've then also got sustainability requirements. So sustainability requirements come into the mix. Some are driven by municipalities and some are driven by funders. So we're talking just about the regulatory process within the municipal practices. There's also the funding requirements. Different funders have different requirements that also then drive uniqueness into the process. That's the traditional sector today. What is very unique to Canada, and I think this is the bit which I actually quite geek out a lot on, is there's a process which is CSA. So CSA A277 is designed as a process that an architect, an electrical, mechanical, and structural engineers. So you've got 4 engineers have to review and sign off on a drawing before it's manufactured. They then also review the work, and they can do that remotely or they can do it in person before it's approved. Once it's approved, it comes with a CSA label. Once a building, for a modular standpoint, has a CSA label on it, it means that the liability shifts from the jurisdiction to the manufacturer who's carrying the CSA label. And so they don't have to go and look behind the walls and do all these inspections, which means their costs are then lower because it has a CSA approval that's attached to it. And so it's actually all about how risk shifts. And the only way that you can, then you look at how can you supercharge all of these things. That's where pre-approved plan sets come in. Because if you've got an engineered design that's pre-done, that you're not having to go through the uniqueness of being able to do it, or the time or the expense, you then have more engineers, like on a Part 9 building, like on a regular house, that sign off on the design more far and above what you would typically see than in a conventional process. And so you've got more engineering that goes into it, and then you've got a CSA process that every building is then stamped off, and there's a third-party agency that comes in to double check that the work was done properly before they'll give the CSA certification, and so they're approving the process. And so all of that is designed to try and de-risk and improve and speed up the full permitting process. So in my mind, an easy solution would be for a jurisdiction to get familiar with CSA 277, and personally, I'll quite happily host them. They can come to the factory, I'll talk them through it, I'll explain it to them. We can geek out over a cocktail party and they can send me home at 10 o'clock, that's fine. I talk to them about what this process is and how it can be effective. And then I think that you can really see a much faster approval process. And then I think they shift into a different mentality, which is now the obligation is almost it's underwritten by CSA. Therefore, they've got more confidence in that process, which I think is a good place to be able to get the industry into the place that it needs to go, and gives everyone the confidence to move forward. And then they can then be looking at how do they speed up the approval process with pre-approved plan sets. Because if you can then speed up the planning process because the design is done, you speed up the actual building official review process and reduce the cost for everybody, right? Because the cost is now coming down because the municipality doesn't have to spend as much time doing all of this work because it's all now sped up. So they go deep on one, gives multiple benefit all the way downstream. That to me is the future.
Standards, procurement, sovereignty. We really hit lots of great CCI themes today. This is excellent. I'm just very conscious of the time here, and don't want to go over, as I know we're standing between well, if you're in central Canada, between you and lunch, perhaps between James's breakfast and him. In his case. So I just want to thank you both. This has been a really, really fascinating conversation, and I always find I learn a lot. And I have the easy job in some sense of just going, interesting, and asking good questions. And thank you to our audience as well. I just want to give a couple shout outs. I saw Mike Moffat came up earlier, and we spoke to Mike and developing this report, and I just want to thank him for his time. And Derek Eaton at the Transition Accelerator is here. So Derek, thank you as well. The report, the Mass Timber Roadmap from the Transition Accelerator was a really, really great piece of work that we used heavily in developing this report. So thank you and of course, Daryl at Digital Government Council is here as well. So thank you, Daryl. And so just want to thank James Broadhead from IGV Housing, Kaylee Thiessen from the Canadian Shield Institute. This has been a really delightful conversation. I'd love to keep that conversation going for folks in the audience here. Feel free to reach out. We'd love to do more work on this. I think, it is, the Canadian crisis to some extent. If we can fix this one, we can make a lot of progress in solving our other challenges. So we'd love to kind of keep working on this and keep plinking away at it, because it's not going to be done in a day, but nothing good really is. So thank you to everyone. Tremendously appreciated. Give a big round of virtual applause for James and Kaylee here. And otherwise, we'll see you next time we publish a report. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.